Hi, folks. Good afternoon. It is noon on Wednesday, so let's officially kick off the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series. I'm your guest stand-in host today in lieu of Dr. Matt Helmers. My name is Ann Stout. I'm with the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Outreach Program. And for today's webinar, we are excited to welcome Jess Gutknecht from the University of Minnesota. So she will be presenting on the water quality and soil benefits of growing Kernza and small grains. So really excited to dive into this topic. She works in a number of areas related to soil health, soil environmental microbiology. And so excited to dive into this space, kind of a unique niche field within looking at perennial vegetation in the conservation arena. So the way the presentation, our session will work today, I'll turn the floor over to Jess in just a moment here, but she'll have about a 25 to 30-minute presentation. And then at the conclusion, we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So as we go, you are welcome to enter your questions into the chat for Jess. And then I'll take a look at those questions and deliver those to her when we get to the end for that Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome Jess Gutknecht. Jess, you're muted.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you. Before I start sharing my screen, I would like to, I was told that you all, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. Yep, my background is in soil ecology. I have also, engaged quite deeply with a lot of the other perspectives of all things growing, making Kernza perennial grain and even other perennial grain things. And so, um, it's also not my expertise, but I want to start before I even share. I'm going to share my slides in just 1 second. And while I get those up, I want everyone to kind of tell me one of three things. Like, is this the first time you've ever heard about Kernza? And then if it's not, have you eaten or grown it? And so maybe throw that in the chat. So I'll kind of know which parts of my talk I'll go through more slowly or more quickly. And I'm going to, yep, pull up my slides while you all are throwing that in the chat. That would be wonderful. And, all right. I'm seeing some thumbs up, and we'll kind of pull up our slide. I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. All right. And then put in so I'm assuming that's at least a thumbs up that you've heard of Kernza before. Um, and yeah, and maybe you can help tell me if we're seeing, I do not see anything in the chat yet, but if you've maybe
I'm not
eaten
either.
or
I
heard of
may
it.
need to adjust some chat settings. So that's on my end, not yours. But
All
I'm seeing
right.
lots
Well,
of raised hands and
I'm
lots of thumbs
seeing,
up. So
yeah, so I at least we're already 5 minutes in, so I already am seeing some thumbs up that told me that at least there's some familiarity. So yep, so what I'm gonna do today, and just throw in the chat as well if Um, did people only see my slides or do you see the toolbar and those things as well?
we're just seeing your slides.
Okay, perfect. So I'll be able to keep the chat up in the corner so that, and maybe you could help me if people have questions. I really, prefer this to be more informal. And so just throw something in the chat if you have a question, if there's something I've gone through too quickly or not. I also have a huge number of extra slides, so we can go into some of the things I'm not going to have time to talk about. Right. So this is kind of what I'm thinking to do today. A little bit of the general history and background, and then I'll talk. So you want to hear about environmental benefits, but also some of the agronomic and breeding considerations. And so I'll kind of hit a lot of those things as the introduction to Kernza, and we'll go from there. So what is Kernza? I saw a lot of thumbs up that maybe a lot of you already know what it is. Um, this is the history of intermediate wheatgrass. It's native to northwestern Asia and introduced to the US in the early 1900s as a forage grass, actually. So from the kind of Fertile Crescent, which is where, many of our grains and forage grasses have come from in the world. Um, Then in around 1952, by then around 12 varieties had been developed for forage from 1952 to 2007 by ARS and different plant materials centers, including Big Flats in New York, which is kind of the next player in our story. And 1984 was a big effort by Peggy Wagoner. Um, and she was a researcher at the Rodale Institute and was looking into different perennial grains and chose intermediate wheatgrass to start breeding because for a grass species, it had relatively large seed size. And some early testing she did showed that, it had like the grain had properties that would make it eventually amenable to be a small grain, supply chain and in products. So from there, this is kind of a whiz through the last 40 years. Since then, I was trademarked Kernza by the Land Institute in 2009. I realized I forgot my trademark sign. This is a screenshot of this kind of overview of the last 40 years of development that I and many colleagues just published a few months ago. In 2016, the first commercial product, Long Root Ale, came out from Patagonia Provisions. 2024, which is the date of the last market scan, by Catherine Chute and colleagues here and that are focusing on commercialization efforts. There are approximately 50 products, not only beer, bread, cereal, crackers, many other things on the market by at least 27 companies. So that's the development. Um, and there are, as of 2026, there are 6 distributors buying and selling cleaned Kernza grain. 19 states with approximately 3,400 active acres. And so this is kind of the state of affairs to date. All right, so here are just a couple of breeding and agronomic considerations. And I'm just going to hit some high points of these and can come back to others as there's interest. So the big effort is increasing seed size and grain yield. Those go hand in hand. If you look at the history of kind of wild types versus domesticated crops, about 90% of that progress is the seed size, actually, and the plant structure that goes along with that. And so there's about, 10%, 8 to 10% per breeding cycle. And that work continues. There are a number of other breeding considerations as well. Oh, there we go. 5 to 10% per cycle. And then here are some other issues that we focus on, or that breeders focus on: shattering, which means the seed falling out before you want to harvest it. Increased threshability. So this is as a non-breeder an interesting thing to me. Always like we don't want the seed to fall out before we harvest it, but we want it to fall out when we want it to fall out. And so the threshability really changes our ability to do the post-processing and get this thing to the makers. And again, the increased seed size. So this is an example of the forage varieties versus annual wheat on the right and these intermediate wheatgrass in the middle. And you can see that that seed size is getting bigger and bigger, which is what we want to see. And there are many, many agronomic challenges. So for the few of you that I see that are already kind of working with this is maybe even literally a slide you've seen before. So what does it look like in rotation? Um, the dual use for foraging grain. Those are kind of some big, like systems level questions that are really exciting. But there are a lot of other issues. The yield longevity and over time, getting it established, what's the right fertility, what's the right weed management, many harvest challenges. So these are kind of many issues in the agronomics and just the, like, how do we get this thing on the ground? Again, I will just show a couple of those. Um, sorry, I'm giving it quick. Uh, I'm going to answer Lee's question super quickly. Do we see more yield from seed size or number of grains on a stalk? Both of those are important. The number of grains on a stalk is like how well is each flower getting fertilized, and that seed developing in the stalk is important. The seed size is also, as I mentioned, if you look at wild types versus the domesticated individuals, like wild maize, maize versus the wild type, about 80 to 90% is seed size, but both of those things are definitely correlated with yields. I'd say the shattering of those seeds is probably a bigger issue about the realized yields. Um, these are some, uh, these are just a couple of resources that are out there. These can both be found on the Land Institute's Kernza.org website, and I'm happy to put links to any of these things in the chat. So a lot of the resources I'm going to talk about come from these guides. So this is just a quick look also at the seed cycle or the plant cycle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we sow the seeds in August, mid-August to early September. There's an establishment phase in the fall, followed by the first year overwintering. This vernalization time is really important for seed production. Then we have spring regrowth, the stem elongation, flowering, green harvest, and then we have this autumn regrowth. And this regrowth, and of course the perenniality and the fact that this was originally bred for forage is how we get some of those dual use or other qualities of the crop. Uh, so these are, again, these different opportunities. And now I'll talk about specifically a couple of these issues. So the first is establishment. How deep should we sow? So this was a preliminary greenhouse experiment where we found that the optimal seed depth was about 3/4 of an inch, but you can see from the stats on the different letters here that, um, you know, 3/4 of an inch is great, but we didn't see a huge amount of variance like close to that. I know it's really hard in the field to get an exact seeding depth, and so there is a little bit of wiggle room. And there is a planting and equipment recommendations as well. This is yet another resource that's out there. And kind of the bigger narrative I want to tell is that there are just becoming a lot of resources out there to get your hands on Kernza and try to work with it. The seeding date. This is a study that was led by Dr. Jake Youngers here, who I also might mention gave me most of these slides. So thank you out into the universe to Jake. Many of you probably know him. So when do I mentioned in that other thing, we are aiming for, mid-August to mid-September. So how important is that seeding date really? This is the study. So it was conducted at 6 sites, including, across the US or the Midwestern US at least. And what they found is that in the north, at least, the earlier the better. So this graph shows the grain yield in pounds per acre and the days after August 15th that seeding occurred. And so earlier is definitely better. Confirmed vernalization is really important, and that's the cold overwintering period. I think the exact details of that vernalization are still being worked out, but that winter period is really important for seed set. In the arid West, where it's really hard at times to do that fall seeding, spring seeding or even spring seeding with a nurse crop is definitely possible and is sometimes the way to go. But you'll sacrifice your first year of grain yields. You will not get grain yields until you've had that first year of establishment and then that vernalization period. And this is where, again, that dual use options, like maybe you're grazing it that first year or doing something else in that system. So the next, of course, super important issue is fertility. Um, this is another study conducted here with a focus here in Minnesota. These are sites across Minnesota. And I would say that, and as you're kind of absorbing this information, I'd say that there are some other kind of exciting efforts happening. There's a multi-state trial that's just being analyzed and written up now. There's also this fall in Minnesota, we're going to be starting a specific like manure fertility trial. So there's a lot happening and still to ask in this fertility questions in space, but this 55 to 75 pounds per acre is still pretty good estimate for fields that are prone to lodging, which is when the plant falls over on you. Minnesota seems to be a little bit more of an issue than other places. We're learning from some of this um, multi-state analysis, but this is still kind of hitting the mark for the best fertility for Kernza, at least for urea application. Yes, that's an annual application rate. This new trial um, is also looking at the fertility timing and other fertility sources. Um, Typically, spring fertilization is what most people are doing at this time. I'm also seeing your question page about why it hasn't like taken off. I will come back to that. Maybe, Anne, you could remind me at the end to come back to that. That is a big question.
Yeah, that's great. Let's
Yeah,
hold on to questions because I may be sometimes we end up getting some of the same questions from multiple folks. So let's hold
perfect.
audience if you want to go ahead and submit them in the chat and then I'll direct them Jess's way when we get to the end. That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Okay, that sounds great. Yep. I'll do that, especially with the bigger ones like that. Okay, this is another opportunity for fertility. And this kind of feeds directly into, in a minute, I'll be talking about environmental quality, and especially water quality issues. And here in Minnesota, nitrate leaching and water quality are a huge issue. And so can we provide soil fertility with a legume intercrop? And so this is a couple of different trials. The that's green on the left is alfalfa Kernza intercrop here on St. Paul campus in Minnesota. There were also some clover mixes in this field. And so there's a lot of attention to, can we do a legume intercrop to diversify the system and provide fertility without mineral fertilizer application? That is also work that's ongoing, but I wanted to just also mention that as a thing that's happening in this realm of conversation. All right, the harvest challenges. This kind of goes hand in hand with the yield longevity question. And so this is a meta-analysis that has just been published here in Minnesota. Again, this is mostly Minnesota data, and there is quite a bit of variance around this when you look, but the first year and sometimes the first and second year, if you don't get good first year establishment, are by far the best producing years. This analysis had, decently strong production in the third year too, sometime, and that can vary. So again, this is a breeding goal is yield longevity, strip tillage, prescribed burns. My lab, we're just in the middle of a root pruning experiment as well to see if that might be a strategy. So, but this is the issue right now, and it's something that a lot of people are actively working on. Yep, and this is the plant biomass. So again, the grain goes down. This great, robust plant keeps itself trucking. All right, so now I'll get to kind of second part of my talk, which is the environmental quality. And I'm seeing we're already at about 20 minutes. So I'll go kind of quickly through this and then still kind of try to keep our last half hour for discussion. So again, there are many, many perspectives on the environmental impacts. My specific training is in soil and soil health. I've done a lot in the carbon sequestration as well and greenhouse mitigation. So I just have one little slide about wildlife habitat. It's such a promising idea. If any of you want to work on it, send us an email. There's a lot of research that's needed because of this potential, but there hasn't been like kind of takeoff of the needed research happening. Water quality. I already kind of gave you a threader into this. This is a huge, huge issue across the US with the basic, yeah, blue baby syndrome, um, increased risks of cancer, um, hypoxia in the Gulf, many, many, many issues related to this. Also related actually to, just to mention how ecosystem services go hand in hand, how when we have excess nitrate, that is nitrate pool that is available for denitrifying bacteria to produce nitrous oxide gas, which is one of the most potent greenhouse gases. The soil is not intact structurally. It also leads to a lot of these issues. And so I'm really, given my own expertise, I'm very, very interested in how these systems kind of build and function together. Yeah. So um, there we go. So this is what a typical nitrogen fertilization system looks like. We're applying maybe 138 pounds per acre for corn. You can see that that's not quite twice, but a lot more than Kernza even needs. Um, and, about 25 to 50 pounds per acre of corn is not taken up and is just leached straight into the soil. This is our typical current situation. I know this is old scientific citation, but this is still very much the this is still very much a situation. We have Kernza, we're seeing, 50 to 60% recovery of nitrogen, depending on the system in the year. And, less than 1 pound per acre is what's going into the groundwater. And that translates, to far, far below the 10 ppm, parts per million concentration that EPA recommends to have drinking water be considered safe. So this is a look from, and this is kind of a small font, but this is from that same fertilizer trial I mentioned that's happening at many states. These are 4 of our sites. So we have Minnesota, Ohio in the next panel, Nebraska, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And then we have on the y-axis, this is the nitrate. And then this is time from April of 2022 down to December of 2024. So this is 3 years. And the BAU is a business as usual treatment that, and I apologize for the overlapping colors, but the business as usual is here in orange on the side panel with the intermediate wheatgrass or Kernza in green. And that was a rotation that in 2022 was corn, 23 was soybean, and 2024 was corn again. And the other colors are also the stars as a BAU, and the other colors, I was mentioning this big fertility trial, are different ways of fertilizing Kernza. So here you can see we have Oh, this is not that clear. I apologize that the figure didn't come through as well. This is exactly what I was trying to fix at the beginning of the seminar. So we have a spring 160, so that's 160 kilograms per hectare, so that's 140 pounds, something like that. Then the squares are um, 60 or are about 90 pounds per acre in the fall, and the light blue is around that in the spring. And having said all that, the big thing that we can see is the big thing that we can see is that in the establishment year, we still have some variance, especially in Ohio. We're seeing that our kind of higher fertilization level of Kernza is still even giving us, well over that 10 parts per million EPA safe drinking water limit, which is the dotted line here. Um, and sometimes that's kind of like in Minnesota, that was kind of on par in that first spring with the business as usual, annual rotation. And then by the second year, though, we drop to, Kearns is getting established. We drop, no matter how we're fertilizing it, to almost no detectable nitrate in these systems. And and so that is this really dramatic, 90 to 95% improvement over time. Um, an interesting thing we're seeing that you might notice is that at some of our sites, the business as usual was going down over time too. And we think that, in the broader perspective of sustainable agriculture, we're still kind of thinking through what that could be, but in an effort to better able like tease apart the specific cropping systems versus the practices, we decided to do this business as usual as a no-till operation so maybe that just lack of disturbance of the soil could also be providing at least some benefit, is our current hypothesis of that. All right, so that is water quality. Now I'll show a little bit about soil health. We've done several studies. This is a study that my lab was engaged with at 3 different sites in Minnesota. Um, we are seeing kind of across the board that this soil aggregation, the physical structure of the soil, again, that's what's related to water quality, that's related to, removed erosional losses, some of these other potential benefits. And that, 1.5 to 1.6 times higher than in the annuals. And we see this even in the first year or two. So like a lot of other benefits can take time to develop, but we see really quickly that the soil structure is coming back. And that could be owed to this very well-developed fibrous root system and the microbial stimulation and all the other things that come with that actually can be harder to detect early on. But we do also see um, in a similar study that our fungal biomass also, especially our like mycorrhizal fungal biomass, that is what is kind of connected to these organisms and is stemming, basically like increasing this root structure into the soil, also develops really quickly. And so we're seeing this kind of root soil biology system and that soil formation happening really rapidly um, as these plants start to develop. And then finally, a bit about the carbon sequestration. I'm not going to talk about greenhouse gas mitigation today, but in translating out to, I'm going to come back to this for just a second. So when we talk about yield and biomass, all of those carbon molecules, are being brought in through photosynthesis, distributed to this biological soil system, this image you see on the right. And where do they go? Do they stay in the soil? Do they build the soil? Do they remove carbon from the atmosphere? How is all of that happening? And those are the questions about carbon sequestration. This is a kind of partial life cycle analysis or a carbon footprint of Kernza. And This is kind of the big snapshot of it. This was published earlier this year. And one interesting thing here is that we see that um, the organic and non-organic systems are actually close to each other. The organic systems don't always have quite the same plant biomass, but if you were to put kind of statistical error bars on this, you'd see that there's no difference. So the way I'm showing this is better to visualize the different compartments of carbon, but it's harder to see yeah, it's harder to see that they're actually like pretty close to each other. You also see that uh, there is still, if we don't think about the carbon in the soil, those carbon removals, we do see that there's some global warming potential still in terms of the kilograms of CO2 per hectare per year. These are about a fifth of what we would see in an annual wheat system, but we didn't do that kind of side-by-side analysis directly, but that's roughly what we see. And the carbon removals, um, you know, are always negative. The variance around them is huge, depending on the system or how it's managed, how much carbon is really staying in the soil. But these are very, initial results considered still, but still very exciting to show that potential. Yep, and then I'm just going to wrap up with a couple of quick slides. So I want to show, yep, I want to show this is the Kernza Cat project. It's actually just wrapping up this year. This should have been 2026, not 2025. So it's USDA NIFA funded, when, um, yeah. And it's allowed us to ask a lot of these much more broader geographic questions outside of just the Minnesota focus that had been, at least in a couple of the studies, there's been a lot of work in Michigan, Land Institute, and across the nation as well. So not to like minimize that perspective, but this was still a really exciting effort. And there's also a very large ARS unit, and it's, between USDA funding and our ARS partners, it's just these are I know that they have sometimes been on chopping, some sites are potentially on chopping block now, but they're just invaluable research partnerships and collaborators that have helped with this effort as well. So that's the kind of fly by night 25 minutes, all things Kernza. So I'm sure we could talk for many hours, but I'll leave it at that. This is some thanks to some different partnerships. This is Soil and Ecosystem Ecology. This is my own lab, Sustainable Cropping Systems lab here, many collaborators here. Each lab actually has a huge number of people. Land Institute has produced a lot of these, materials that I've mentioned to you. Yeah, and with that, I'm really happy to. I'm also, these are resources I'll throw in the chat, but I'm really happy to take questions or start our conversation at this point. Yeah. I don't know. Anne, do you want to help direct me, or should I just
I'd
start
be happy
tackling these?
to. Yeah, that sounds great. So,
Okay.
Jess, if you want to go ahead and get those links put in the chat, and then if you can also help me advance through these next couple housekeeping slides, that'd be
Oh,
awesome.
I
And then
forgot
we'll dive
those.
into
Yeah.
questions.
Maybe I'll help you advance these and then I will, yep, I'll let you do your slides
We
and
can hit,
then
sounds
I will
good.
maybe stop sharing for just a second so I can put
No
those
worries. Yeah,
different resources
absolutely.
up.
So thank you all for joining us today for the webinar. Really appreciate it. If you've tuned in seeking a Certified Crop Advisor Continuing Education Unit, a CEU, please go ahead and send an email today by 5 o'clock to Alena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. Again, by Wednesday, April 29th, today at 5 o'clock. And please include in that information your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, if that's different, and then your CCA number as well. And then we'll get that submitted on your behalf to the CCA board. We can go ahead to the next slide. And big time thanks to our key partners that helped to make the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar Series possible. We definitely could not do it without these partners week in and week out. So huge thanks to the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship, the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, Iowa Nutrient Research Center, and the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. All right, next slide. I'd invite you to participate in this voluntary demographic survey. So if you have been a regular follower of the Island Conservation webinar series, you've seen this before, but this is a voluntary demographic survey for USDA funded programs. So they just ask for one response for all 2026 webinars in our series. You can go ahead and scan the QR code on your screen using a smart device there, or if you'd prefer to work on, type in the survey, type in the address, iowalearningfarms.org/survey will get you there as well. So appreciate your willingness to help out on that front.
All right.
All right. Yes, next week we'll be continuing next Wednesday at noon, May 6th. And we'll be switching over to some edge of field conservation practices. So Isan Gain from Michigan State University will be our presenter as we dive into looking at saturated buffers, proven practice with new surprises. So stay tuned for that next Wednesday, May 6th. And then I think
Nice.
one more final housekeeping slide here, which is you can find today's webinar and all of our past webinars archived on our website, iowalearningfarms.org/webinars will get you there. And if you want to go directly through YouTube, we've got the webinars archived there as well. Same recordings, but they are sorted by playlists on YouTube. So if you want a quick way to find topics of interest, that's a great way to go as well. Okay, so we have a lot of questions that have come in, which is awesome. So let's go ahead and
Yeah.
dive in. I'd like to actually hit a couple big picture questions first. So one of our questions was basically, what are the big ticket uses of Kernza, or what uses can you
Mhm.
see it having if it were to replace annual grains?
Yeah, so it can, um, yeah, it has any use you could imagine. Maybe I'll go here. I'll let people imagine while I talk. Um, it has, you could imagine that it has any use that another small grain would have. So bread, crackers. I know people who have made bread with 100% Kernza. It's challenging. It's kind of it's lower gluten at this time. So it almost like if you've ever worked with like a rye type of a bread, it has a lot more moisture in it. Most people are often doing like a 20-30% Kernza or plus annual wheat in a lot of the breads and crackers and things. I've made a scone with 100% Kernza myself. Pizza dough. And then if you move, yeah, so the beer is still a major market as well. I should have mentioned that Patagonia now has a non-alcoholic beer as part of their portfolio, in a partnership with Deschutes Brewing, which is a West Coast brewery. So, yeah, so it really has any of those uses that you could do with annual grains. It's just the lower gluten makes it a little more challenging to put in leavened breads, but it's definitely doable. Yeah, you can
Excellent.
find
So
lots of products out there.
lots of
Yeah.
applications in terms of human food as well as
Yeah.
animal feed. I know you mentioned grazing. We've had a few grazing
Hmm.
questions that have come in. So I wanted to hit those together. With grazing in particular, have you done nutritional content analysis of the fall
Hmm.
regrowth?
Yeah, there's been nutritional analysis across the board, and there are, yeah, I'm trying to think of a way to can I direct people to some of the, I don't know if it'd be like emailing you some resources afterward, Anne would be a good way to do this, but I'll kind of lean on my working knowledge of some of the studies that have come out. But yeah, the forage quality is great. The spring and fall regrowth are the best quality you could imagine. Then that summer straw. It's kind of a fine, this, I'll start with the lowest quality maybe. It's the summer straw does get eaten over the winter, but it's not as high quality. You could imagine that. The fall forage is quite high quality, as is the spring. It's trickier to graze it in the spring because you have to be really careful to get the animals off of it before the stems start to elongate, or you'll sacrifice the grain yield in the same year. Um, and I'm going to answer the question that literally just came in about this as well. No, the fall grazing is not, does not hurt the longevity at all. If anything, it slightly improves it. There are a couple of studies that came out some years ago. It doesn't change the game for this yield decline, but it does like ever so slightly improve the grain yields the following year.
Yeah,
Um,
that's great. We had multiple questions on that front, so that's really
yeah,
helpful to
yeah. So
address that one.
at the very least, you're not sacrificing the grain yields. Is there an appreciable difference in your grain yields? That I think is really not determined well, but you're definitely not sacrificing. It's definitely, another revenue stream, which is great. Um, and maybe I'll hit this as well. I don't have great numbers for any of people asking about the economics or the price per bushel, but I could direct you to those resources. One of the just screenshots I showed was the kind of production report, and I mentioned just acreage, but there's a lot of information is there in there as well.
And
Um,
early on, you had shown us a graph or a couple graphs looking at grain yield versus the stand age. You had shown, I think, 4 years of data there.
yeah.
Folks had questions, basically, how many years of production are we hoping to see out of each seeding of Kernza? Is 4 years the target, or do you expect to see even more beyond that?
Right now, like the best production years are usually the first year or two. Um, it seems like, yeah, it seems, and this is, me not being quite an expert in this, but it seems like the first year, the only time you don't get the best yields, at least here in the upper Midwest, is when you had like fall weed pressure. I didn't talk about weeds, but it's the fall weed pressure can be an issue. So if you don't get good establishment, that's where you could take a first year yield hit. But um, it the first 2 years, sometimes the third year are definitely the best. And then it's kind of a choice up to your operation. Like you could graze it in the years after that if you want to keep it, if you don't want to put it in rotation with something else. Some of the kind of slower developing like total organic matter, total soil carbon, those things seem to take the 3 to 4 years to develop. So, yeah, it kind of just depends on, yeah, can you be grazing it when you stop having as much grain? Um, the there are people who keep it in longer. I don't know off the top of my head, like on average, how long people are keeping it in. And there are a number of other, this might, maybe I'm getting into another question, but there are a number of other considerations as well. Um, the, um, are you selling your grain? Is there supply chain? There are now 6 distributors, and I think there's a lot of effort into the post-processing and the buying and kind of moving the grain to market. It's a small seed size. This is kind of the same issue that any honestly agricultural innovation faces is this like middle supply chain and getting processors and distributors for something that's new and novel at a middle scale is really it's not custom, it's not the behemoth gorilla like General Mills. That is like the sticking point for many innovations in the food systems. And that is for Kernza too.
But while you're on the slide that you're currently on, we did have a question come in about root pruning. I know you had mentioned that early on. What's the reason for that? What does that do in terms of the, year of growth ahead?
Yeah, so the reason, I mean, it's a similar reason of like the thought there, and there are many theories about why it stops producing seed. This one is this kind of paradigm of perennials, like, it does grow rhizominously, so and it tillers, and so it can, sexually propagate itself through seeds. It can also, asexually propagate itself through these other means, vegetative growth. And so, um, you know, is there like, when it's not root bound, but when it's developed a full stand, is that a signal to the plant that it doesn't need to produce seeds anymore? Like I'm in place. I do not need to invest energy in seeds. So, and we know that if we take a single tiller from an individual plant and plant it, it'll act like a first year plant again. And so if we prune and cut the roots, this is a pretty new idea from one of our growers up here, actually, that one of my PhD students is just tried out last fall. If we prune and cut the roots, is it going to be the same as resetting that plant back to like a single tiller or a single thing? So that we are just at the beginning of this little trial. We cut them, they didn't die. So now we're going to see over the course of this year if they actually yield or not. We've also done taken samples and are starting to process them to see the nutrient allocation. So perennials also like pull in their nitrogen and other nutrients over the winter. So did it do that in a different way? Is that a clue to this yield decline? And I think a big part of this yield decline is still the kind of nature nurture. How far can we get through management? I showed the prescribed burns in strip this strip tillage, those smaller scale burns and the strip tillage helped a little bit, but they didn't help tremendously. I hate to say this as a like ecosystem ecology person, but in the very far north of Minnesota, which is big like grass seed production, they they burn everything every year right after harvest, and they do not see yield decline at all. So take that information what you will. But that there is indication that some kind of management can help with this yield decline. Again, it's also a huge focus in terms of the breeding efforts. And this kind of question with breeding, do we just keep boosting like first and second year yields to get it more on par with other crops? Or, do we try to keep breeding something that'll keep producing seeds over time as well? It's kind of a little deeper dive in the thinking of how to tackle this issue.
It sounds like there's a lot of questions y'all are actively looking at, so we may need to have you back for another webinar to share some results down the road.
I,
So
I should bring a breeder with me next time.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's all good. We have had
Uh,
several questions related to soil biology, and I want to make sure we get to those because I think that's kind of your sweet spot too, right? So there's
sure.
several questions
Yeah.
about fungal. So speak more to the fungal increases and how it's measured. And then there was
Hmm.
another question also um, about the AMF and so why it's lower for Kernza with alfalfa compared to Kernza alone. So can you speak to kind of the fungal community and what you're seeing
Hmm.
with this Kernza perennial system?
Yeah. So Kernza is a cool season grass. Actually, doesn't even matter that it's cool season. Most grasses have mycorrhizal fungal relationships. And these are arbuscular mycorrhizal fungal relationships, which is a closer kind of symbiosis. I'll go back to my little soil health picture, although I don't know if it's gonna. Oh, I should give shout outs to some people. This picture is GP. He's obviously the person measuring these things, a PhD student that's gonna be defending later this year. All right, give some shout outs because I didn't have a lot of people's pictures in here. Right, so yep, so in this grass and in many agronomic crops, we have these arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi that have really close associations. You can't totally see them in this picture, but they, this type of mycorrhizal fungi doesn't mineralize or like decompose nutrients directly themselves as the ectomycorrhizae do, but they are still like really actively mining. And because they're mining and they are just another life form in the soil, they are still kind of activating a whole community. That's why I want to come back to this picture. And that's kind of the theory of how they act. And um, so we just see this remarkable increase in arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi with Kernza growth. And I'll get to the Kernza alfalfa question in just a minute, but we've actually in this particular slide, we measured this with indicators using phospholipid fatty acid analysis, which is just the cell membranes. So we extract the cell membranes of the whole microbial community, and there are indicators for fungi in general or these AMF fungi. Um, we also use the neutral lipids, which are specific to fungi. The joke being that eukaryotes store fat like fungi or like us. And bacteria don't. So those are really good fungal indicators. Because not, I've been, PLFA is a specialty of my lab. I've been doing it for a really long time, and not every indicator is like bulletproof, but that's another way we get at this. We can also look at the total biomass or the bacterial biomass in the soil as well. So it's a nice method to get at a lot of different components of the soil biology. Having said all of that, we've also have found actually this same previous graduate student, Emma Link, did also find increases in the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi using DNA-based methods as well. And that's a method where we extract all the DNA instead of that lipid membrane, or the lipids in the soil, we extract the DNA from the soil and we amplify either regions for arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, for other, full fungal community structure. So I guess we're not just tackling the AMF, but we're tackling the whole fungal community structure or the whole bacterial community structure and looking at those profiles. And we see similar results there, that we see in general the fungi increasing and especially the AMF increasing. So
Sounds
we've found
good.
this for a couple of different methods, and it's often the kind of year two that this starts to show up, and then year three we see really, really significant changes.
All right. So for the sake of time, I think we'll do two more questions, and I do want to make sure we can get to the Kernza alfalfa question. So someone
Oh,
had,
I forgot.
yeah, had
Oh,
asked
yeah, yeah.
about
Sorry.
dual cropping Kernza
Okay.
alfalfa system. Any updates on that system? And then so I'll let you address that one, and then we're going to come back to a question from earlier on about kind of barriers, and that'll take us through to the end of our time. So let's
Okay.
talk
And was
Kernza and
there,
alfalfa.
yeah, and the Kernza alfalfa, was this only regarding the AMF, or were there other Kernza alfalfa questions too?
There's questions just in general about the Kernza alfalfa system as well, like any updates to share in terms of yield, environmental benefits, etc.
Yeah, yeah. I do not know if I have a good update about the yields, but I have a little kind of general, can talk a little more generally about it. This question, I forgot to answer this about why it's lower. Um, the big answer is that we don't totally know. It was really surprising to us as well. Because actually alfalfa is also arbuscular mycorrhizal. So one idea we have is that if the Kernza and alfalfa, this kind of gets at all these other questions as well, like if they're competing, sometimes they compete with each other. We've seen studies where the alfalfa can even start to take over the Kernza. Actually, since you looked at this a lot, I'll go back to this picture of the Kernza alfalfa. This kind of gets at it a little bit as well. So sometimes the alfalfa can actually totally take over. So do we see a situation where the alfalfa is almost like limiting the Kernza, and that's why we don't, now alfalfa maybe if it's growing really well, maybe it's not investing in those mycorrhizal relationships the same way that the Kernza would be. Um, we see Kernza kind of a very effectively mining for nitrogen in any case. Another perhaps thought is things other than nitrogen fertility. So, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi are assist with nitrogen, but they're really make their name for phosphorus acquisition. And alfalfa, although it's mycorrhizal fungal, it is really good at also taking up phosphorus or other micronutrients, and it even luxury consumes things like potassium. So in that same study, we actually saw that or in another study, we've seen that, the potassium can sometimes be lower in alfalfa stands than other stands because it luxury consumes some of those micronutrients. And so, is it, yeah, again, like, is it taking over the stand in that question? I don't remember the details from that particular study, if that's the answer to that one. It also, the taproot, the soil moisture can change. Is the alfalfa itself like limiting micronutrients for the Kernza or for the microbial community? So those are kind of, a few of the reasons we're thinking about why this Kernza alfalfa maybe isn't as mycorrhizal as the Kernza by itself. It doesn't have the fibrous root system, so just that root network is lower as soon as you introduce alfalfa. It has the taproot structure instead. So anyway, there are a number of hypotheses, and we haven't kind of gotten into exactly pinpointing that issue. But I hope this starts to address some of the issues of the intercropping as well. So um, yeah, so they can go hand in hand quite nicely together. Alfalfa can be kind of overly aggressive. In a big legume study where we actually used isotopic tracing to like follow the nitrogen through the system. We did that for 3 years at multiple sites in Minnesota a few years ago and found that um, red clover was kind of a winner in some cases of just its ability by the third year to transfer nitrogen from the red clover over to the Kernza. That was a kind of an interesting study that we looked at in terms of like what's going to be a good partner or not. The management's tricky, and I don't know if anyone's done this on a really broad scale. Trying to think of, I don't believe there's been and I would not know this necessarily, but is there production acreage of a legume intercropping happening? I don't know if that's the case yet. So it's something that's still kind of very much an experimental system.
Yeah, definitely an area of active research and trying to
Yeah,
figure
it's
out
definitely
the
an area of active research,
scale.
but
And
it's
yeah,
very
absolutely.
exciting. I know some people are like cutting the whole thing together as for another forage opportunity
Yeah.
is definitely something, how to grow them together that you could harvest each individually is another big question. Yeah.
So just to wrap things up in consideration of time, I'm gonna tie it back together with Kernza seems like it has a lot of promise and it's been around for a while. So what would you say are the top three reasons, in your opinion, why hasn't it taken off more than it has? What would you say are some of the challenges or barriers, top three reasons?
Top three reasons. Whoo-hoo. Uh, I mean, uh, I mean, one reason is just that, small grain in the last 20 to 30 years, small grain production in general in the US has gone down. And so you have an uphill, let alone all these management issues I've talked about. It's an uphill battle. It's just in the last few years that people are starting to really try to bring back small grains in the first place. Yeah. In the markets, I think Lee in the chat is answering this for me. So yeah, bringing back the markets for small grains in general is going to boost all of them, including Kernza. There is this issues I mentioned with this mid supply chain, and again, like those market barriers. There's also a lot of, so getting it into, if any of you are making products or interested, like, yeah, like getting it processed well, growing that infrastructure, growing the equipment. I know this is something that like the co-op is interested in. Back to other small grains. You all are in Iowa and in the southeast of Minnesota. There's this really exciting work with oats as another small grain of people getting together to invest in that equipment to process and get it in people's hands. There are a lot of kind of recipes and products starting to be developed. And so I think that has space that it could fly potentially more. So I think, there's also not quite in the same realm, but I would also say the policy. So the policy lock-ins of our current agricultural systems and the fact that, yeah, like there is not a good there's no crop insurance for Kernza. So de-risking it is another huge issue. And so I think it's, if it's not like flying into the market, and we talked about those issues, um, you're taking on even more risk. And I know there's a program, there's movement in this world as well. I am about over time, but are, Kernza and Perennial grains are now in the NRCS rules as for the incentive programs. So that policy support for de-risking is happening. There is a program in Minnesota, EECO, that I believe is specific only to Minnesota growers, but that's another model of a program to incentivize or de-risk crops such as Kernza. So those efforts are starting to happen, but it's that, yeah, double whammy of a market needing to grow and a really high level of risk for growers. Another thing, this is something I saw in the chat earlier, is that the perhaps natural existing market or natural growers are mostly organic, and so I think a lot of the effort to get it into those other bigger markets, of course growing the organic market as well, is another perspective of the kind of current situation market efforts. So if you had buyers and product makers and businesses interested in the I don't want to say conventional. And in the LCA, you'll notice we didn't say organic and conventional. We said organic and non-organic because you couldn't consider this conventional for many reasons. But I think like increasing into more market spaces with how it's grown is another opportunity for folks.
Absolutely. There's a lot of
Um,
intertwined factors at play for sure, but
yeah,
it's
and
exciting to
I
see
think
the
I
promise.
also, oh, I'm sorry, could I say one that I know we're way over time,
Yeah,
but I
we
think this
need to wrap
last,
up. So one final thought, and then we got to wrap up.
yeah, well, this last comment that maybe, I think this last comment that people could see, yeah, that I think people get fussy. I mean, this is a good last comment. People get fussy about how quickly it's growing, and I think that is wonderful spirit because we all asked that question out of seeing a world that needed to change yesterday. And so much like enthusiasm and passion in this space. But I think someone just put in the chat a perspective that, 60 years ago, 80 years ago, around World War II, soybeans were not a thing anyone even thought of, and they dominate cropping systems today. And so um, I think that is an important perspective to keep in mind that it will, it still can grow tremendously as all of us are asking these questions. That's how I would wrap up.
Yeah, that's wonderful. There's a ton of
Yeah.
potential, right? I mean, in terms
Yeah.
of Kernza's benefits, in terms of conservation, environmental impacts, water quality, soil health, and we recognize, I mean, so there's a ton of potential growth and an abundance of challenges right now too, with a lot of intertwined factors at play, but many of these other changes also have not happened overnight. So we'll continue to follow the work that you all are doing. This is really exciting research, and continue to follow Kernza as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. We really appreciate it. And a friendly reminder, next week, May 6th, will feature Isan Gain from Michigan State University with saturated buffers. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.